Hello and welcome to this special episode of the Sustainability Series on location here at COP26 in Glasgow. I'm Mark Barton. Here in Scotland's largest city, almost 200 countries are represented, and there's an urgent need to act on climate change. Bold measures are required from both governments and business leaders at this 26th Conference of Parties to translate commitments to reduce carbon emissions into meaningful action. In this series, we'll discuss the innovative technologies and solutions needed to transition to a low-carbon world and examine the policies required to remove obstacles to the broad development and broad adoption of clean technologies. Here's how ABB is helping industries and communities transition to a low-carbon economy.
We are at an inflection point in history.
It's time for humanity to grow up.
We all know by now that we're at a turning point, but we believe there's still time to make meaningful change through innovative technology. At ABB, we're helping industries and communities make real advances towards a low-carbon, circular economy. Technology is helping us address the world's energy challenges as society transitions to cleaner power and cleaner fuel. Right now, almost half the world's electricity is used to power motors in factories and other buildings. New ultra-high efficiency motors are transforming industries, drastically cutting energy use and helping sectors achieve the EU's goal of improving energy efficiency by nearly a third by 2030. And we're in a new era of sustainable transport, not just on the roads, but on rail and at sea, where new technologies are targeting the shipping industry, which currently accounts for around 2.5% of global CO2 emissions. And through all these changes, we have to keep empowering people with new skills and opportunities, making use of digital technologies to enable new, smarter business models. Many of the solutions already exist, so how do we maximize their use? How can industry work best with lawmakers and regulators to build a cleaner, smarter future for all of us?
Today's panel discussion, filmed live in Glasgow during COP26, is Embedding Sustainability. The private sector has a key role to play in achieving net zero by 2050 through reducing emissions in industry, the built environment, and in transport, which together account for 3/4 of global CO2 emissions. Companies must also invest in energy-saving technologies and new business models that not only reduce direct emissions, but also support the circular economy and social progress in both the developed and developing world. In this panel, we'll examine how policymakers and business leaders can collaborate to speed up the energy transition and promote the global diffusion of relevant technology innovations for the benefit of all nations. Now, before I introduce our panelists, I want to set the stage for our discussion today by welcoming Selwyn Hart, Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Climate Action and Assistant Secretary General of the Climate Action Team, who I spoke with earlier. Selwyn, COP26 is arguably the most important UN climate conference ever. What's the United Nations message to stakeholders in Glasgow and to those watching in from across the world?
COP26 is certainly the most important COP since the signature and finalization of the Paris Agreement some 6 years ago. The reality is that we are not on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, including the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. And Glasgow really must be that moment where the world accelerates progress towards closing the gap on mitigation, which means keeping the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement alive. It must also be a moment where we accelerate progress towards closing the gap on finance. Over a decade ago, developed countries committed to provide at least $100 billion in climate support to the developing world. We're still not there, but there has been some good progress. And we're hoping that at Glasgow and after Glasgow, that progress will be accelerated. And finally, on adaptation and resilience, we're seeing impacts all over the world, and we must close this huge gap on adaptation and resilience to protect the most vulnerable who are already experiencing climate-related impacts.
On using your phraseology, accelerating progress, Selwyn, how do we accelerate progress and accelerate collaboration between businesses and governments in this multilateral world to create a sustainable world?
Thank you. And we're already seeing this through many of the coalitions that have been launched. These coalitions are also growing. Many of these coalitions were launched at the Secretary General's Climate Summit in 2019, and they've grown from strength to strength. I will give you one example, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which is an alliance which started as a coalition of the willing, just under 20 firms that collectively managed around 2 trillion in assets. That has grown to over 60 firms and with assets of over $10 trillion. So we need these multi-stakeholder coalitions. But more importantly, or equally importantly, we need governments to set the right signals, send the right policy signals. The nationally determined contributions that many countries have put on the table here in Glasgow will need to be backed up by credible domestic policies and measures at home.
And creating that favorable environment to foster innovation and adoption of clean technology, Selwyn, I know is very important. How do we accelerate the fostering of that to benefit both developed and developing nations and to ensure we get this just transition?
Well, it requires all hands on deck. We need new forms of collaboration between government and private sector, civil society, but also between governments as well. One of the big concerns that we have at the United Nations is that if the global response to the climate crisis is not dealt with in a just, fair, and equitable manner, many countries will be left behind. And we're already seeing this on vaccines. We're already seeing this on the global economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. We can't afford to do this on climate finance. So this is why the 100 billion as a floor is extremely, absolutely essential. Governments across the developing world need to sit together and, as you correctly said, foster innovation, foster partnerships on many of the issues related to clean energy deployment, as well as in areas like resilience building. It will require for us to be on this 1.5 degree pathway over the course of the next decade. The amount of investments in clean energy efficiency will need to triple. And that cannot only be done by governments. It cannot only be done by a handful of governments. It will require new ways of collaboration across borders and also within economies as well.
Selwyn, there's this in the on the horizon. There's this year. There's this date, 2050, and there's this net zero term which we've all latched onto. Is there a risk by focusing too far into the distance, into 2050, that we lose sight of the near term? We lose sight of this decade and the importance of 2030.
Absolutely agree. And this is one of our biggest concerns. Committing to net zero is fine. It's a good signal, but there is no credible or feasible pathway to net zero without deep emission cuts over the course of this decade. The race to net zero will be won or lost in the 2020s. Decarbonization of energy systems is absolutely necessary and imperative in the 2020s. And the reality is that we have the technologies, we have the financial instruments to do this. So immediate action in the 2020s is absolutely critical if we are to be on a net zero by 2050 pathway. We cannot afford to focus on 2050, to delay action until the 2030s, the 2040s, or the 2050s. Action must start and it must accelerate during the course of this decade.
It's my pleasure to be joined today here in Glasgow by Theodore Swedgemark, Chief Communications and Sustainability Officer at ABB, Ulrika Modir, Assistant Secretary, UNDP, and Jamie Regal, CEO of Formula E. Theo, we've heard Selwyn Hart speak. There's a lot to unpack there. How are you feeling about that Paris goal to the Paris goal of 1.5% degrees by 2050? Are you feeling as should we say as confident, as cautious as Selwyn Hart felt?
Well, I think it's his speech is an excellent one, and it's great to have him with us also in that sense. I think it's a powerful reminder of what's really at stake here in Glasgow at COP26 this year. If we don't take the right steps forward now as a global community, we will risk significantly not being able to meet the 1.5 degree scenario of the Paris Agreement. We as a global technology leader, we think it's possible. We stand firmly behind this, and we try to do whatever we can to encourage leaders and peers and value chain participants, including working with the United Nations or organizations like Formula E through the ABB Formula E World Championship to try to drive this agenda. And today, a lot of the technology that is needed is available, and things like energy efficiency, electric mobility are going to be crucial to make
to drive this agenda. Formula E, already you're dropping the puns. Good start, Theo. Ulrika, what's your assessment of Selwyn Hart's comments as we sit here in Glasgow, you in spirit, at COP26?
Well, United Nations Development Programme, we are accompanying 170 member states in support of their sustainable development plans. And we know, as a matter of fact, and this has of course also been what the IPCC report has put forward, that we are far off track with regard to reaching the reduction of global warming to 2%, let alone 1.5%. As a matter of fact, we're heading towards 2.7 degrees of warming. And what we see across the world, also in the global north, is droughts, forest fires, floods, and a lot of devastation. And we need to take these signals, these alarm bells very seriously. But also, as we are also accompanying countries in their increased ambitions, their pledges, their plans, the so-called national determined contributions, we can tell that the quality of the plans that countries are making right now have improved significantly. So while reduction targets are not met, and while we don't see enough of investment with regard to adaptation, we do believe that these plans can actually form the basis of a change that we need to see happening right now. Yeah. And we also believe that we need to see this change happen across governments. We need a whole of government and also a whole of society approach to this in each and every country. So that's why it's important to also work with the private sector, of course.
Yeah, which we're going to talk more in depth about shortly, Ulrika. Jamie, from your perspective, Selwyn Hart's comments.
Well, I think it's a mixture of apprehension, but also optimism. I mean, Formula E was started 7 years ago with racing electric cars. So, from a Formula E perspective, we've had a long-term vision around the importance of transport and in addressing climate change. Things have been really slow, though. Things have been really slow, and I think what's really encouraging as we sit here today, and what Selwyn remarked about the importance of the next decade in terms of that exponential impact. Now is the time to act, and I think the fact that we're all here in Glasgow with COP26. Government, business coming together, and the level of urgency, I think, as Ulrika just mentioned, some of the, Canadian forest fires and heat waves and things like this, I think it's becoming very real at the moment. And so that level of action that we're seeing with this conference is encouraging, but the time is now, as you say.
And to use the inroads analogy again, Theo, because it's wonderful, how do we ensure that all the stakeholders, who are present in Glasgow and who are watching from across the world? How do we make sure they collaborate further to achieving these goals?
Well, I think the event in itself is a platform for achieving that. And I think also the series that we're doing here together is helping on that track. But we look at this very much we're a global company. We're active in more than 100 countries around the world. We have 105,000 employees. And we are active as a technology company in a few key sectors. So we have transport, industry, and kind of building cities very much. And these sectors account for roughly 3/4 of the world's energy and consumption and CO2 emissions. And as I said before, we firmly believe that the technology that is needed to make this transition happen is available, especially when you talk about the medium point or the 2030, reducing it by 50%. For sure, innovation will play a key part. So it's about coming together. And it's, again, I alluded to it also in the opening statement, which is one of the key reasons why we engage both with the UN very actively, but also through platforms like Formula E, because we believe in the partnerships and we believe in bringing people together and collaborating. COP in itself is more about countries coming together. And of course, we're all here to try to encourage and, get them to raise the bar of what they commit to do. But we are really here to support through that. So, and I think also to what Ulrika said, at the moment, I think the IEA latest figure I saw is they're only 20% at the moment in terms of commitments from countries as to what is really needed to achieve net zero by 2050. And so I think everyone deserves, or everyone needs to take their leadership from their specific dimension, speak up and push for their agenda as loud as possible. And we are here to try to do exactly that.
Ulrika, what's your message to, you phrased it so eloquently. How do we turn these ambitions into meaningful action? Because that's what COP's about, isn't it? We've heard a lot of rhetoric. It's about the how now. It's about the actual action. But how do we do that? Because a lot's discussed in that phrase, but how do we achieve it from your standpoint, from the UNDP?
Yeah, no, and here's, of course, where I find this COP incredibly interesting, but also quite promising. And I also believe that we need to look at how to accelerate. And now countries have come forward with their national determined contributions, their climate pledges with regard to reduction emission, but also emissions reduction, but also adaptation measures. And what we see is that these NDCs, these climate plans, they can also be turned into investment plans. We also know that we have a multi-trillion investment gap that needs to be addressed. But many of these projects are not actually projects for overseas development assistance. They are commercial projects that needs to happen. And what we can do then, of course, is to see to that we, through partnerships, also turn these pledges and plans into more of investment maps, where we can also drive these investments. And of course, also as UNDP, we would be there also to support the conditions that needs to be in place, well-functioning societies, anti-corruption work, the governance work that needs to be in place, legislations and so on that could also incentivize more investments towards also the least developed and also middle-income economies. I mean, all of this and the increased ambition that we need to see is also happening in the midst of a pandemic that is still very much felt, not least in the global south. So I think it's very important also to look at how we can integrate these plans also into the recovery plans of countries and really make them happen and see how we can accelerate action through also a lot of partnerships.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about partnerships and policy and regulation, Jamie, as well. How did COVID obviously shortened the Formula E season, didn't it, last year? We had more races this year. We're going to hopefully get back to normal, in the next season. Has COVID made it more difficult for you to preach the electrification, sustainable message that you've been so eloquently doing in the last 7 years? Did it distract at all, or did it help enhance the message?
Yeah, I would say there were two forces. From an enhanced perspective, I think when everyone was on lockdown, sitting at home, thinking about their place in the world, and it was very humbling, I think, for all of humanity, there was maybe a heightened appreciation for our natural environment, right? So I think there was a lot of human introspection around the importance of the planet. We saw big reductions in emissions just simply because factories weren't operating and whatnot. So the trends are positive in that regard. And I think what you're seeing is more people are buying electric vehicles. So So that's the good news. On the other hand, we were in the live events business, and we were in the business of aggregating human beings together in a single space, which has been a particularly challenging problem for us to address for the last 2 years. What we were able to do, though, is put on the races in very safe fashion. And in fact, I think we showed society how you could operate with COVID protocols and testing and all kinds of restrictions that would still allow us to put our product on. Ultimately, we weren't able to aggregate 30, 40,000 people at a race as we'd love to do, but we still broadcast the races around the world on television, on our social media channels, et cetera. And sort of paradoxically, because people were at home, they were looking for things to watch. And there were some companies like Netflix that benefited from that, but we also benefited as well. We saw our audience increase. So, we have to think about a multi-platform distribution to be able to tell our story. Clearly, that human experience is central to sport, and that was missed. But we use the media to expand our message. And we're actually pretty optimistic as we enter next year. We hope to do 16 races, which will be our record. And we're going to race in Jakarta. We're going to race in Mexico. We're racing in Seoul for the first time. And Vancouver. So we're adding new cities and expanding. And that's how we bring our message globally. We've got to take it to more and more countries.
Yeah. Let's talk about technology. It's something that we've already brought up, Theo. This is a question I asked Selwyn Hart about the technologies, many of the technologies that we need to transition to this low carbon world. As you said, they already exist. But how can we foster adoption of these solutions to benefit both the developed and the developing nations?
It's a complicated topic and it's a complicated thing. But I mean, the good news is to start, we see as a company in what we do, we already see very strong demand from our customers today. So I think the whole journey has started and it's already ongoing. So topics like energy efficiency, where we produce very highly energy efficient motors and drives and things like this. We really see the customers today. They come and they start looking at, okay, how can I reduce my environmental footprint? And there's of course a policy and a regulatory dimension to that. So I think that's going into that. The fact that it's also working in the commercial sector, but it's also driven by what is happening by governments who are raising the stakes. For example, the EU already, put in place new legislation earlier this year, more to come, which we are, of course, big supporters of, because we believe, that the not used energy is the best way to reduce impact immediately. So the more energy efficient you can be from the beginning, the better. But I think it's, as you said, and there was big commitments already made earlier. And the rich world, let's call it like that, haven't delivered on this yet towards the poor nation of this $100 billion of investment.
Hopefully we'll achieve that within a year or so.
Exactly. Or hopefully there will be even more better news, towards that trajectory here at this COP. Of course, as I said in the beginning, we are active in 100 countries. That includes a lot of the rich part of the world, but also developing part of the world. We want to lead by example as a company. So, for example, by going carbon neutral as a company ourselves, we will do that no matter which part of the world it is. So besides, of course, providing technology to our customers and suppliers and society, we will also lead by example in doing it in our own operations and thereby also help bring and educate people everywhere on these topics.
Yeah. What about from your standpoint, Ulrika, from the UNDP standpoint, and the adoption, the promotion? How do you help in that process, whether it's technologies which are new or whether it's helping incentivize the adoption of new technologies? What's your role in that?
So as I shared with you previously, UNDP has had the pleasure, I must say, to accompany 120 member states in the development of their increased ambitions and their second generation of NDCs, these climate plans. And as I said, also, they are of much higher quality with much better data. They have more detailed costing, and they also link to sectoral planning in countries. And what we see with regard to energy, as an example, is that 90% have increased the mitigation ambition with regard to energy efficiency and so on. And 100% of them include energy, with 95% of them having standalone detailed energy targets. And that, of course, tells us that if we are then able to support countries to turn these plans into also investment plans, we can also connect different dots with also the private sector being interested also to do these kind of investments that are also commercial, viable, bankable projects. So here, I think that we have huge possibilities if we are able then to move from pledge to impact and turn these plans into more of investment plans alongside with ODA that needs to be there to support. We believe that we can do a lot and scale up the work with private sector engagement.
Yeah, Jamie, you were talking about the ways of getting the message across through all the channels that you use. It's clear e-mobility is your thing, but you're more than that. You're about raising the profile of sustainable development in transport, in electrification, in cities, in factories as well. Tell us about how that's all going, how you achieve that.
Well, it's interesting. When Formula E was started in 2014, I think it's pretty fair to say that the world wasn't looking for another motorsport. Those fans were very well served. Equally, we don't believe that necessarily the world was looking for another advocacy group. What we did was try to bring the two together, bring the power of sport, which inspires humans to action, whether it's football or where I'm from, ice hockey. It really triggers your emotional response, and use that to tell a powerful story about the climate crisis. And the product itself is very much focused on the 30% or so of emissions that are coming from transport, right? So it's how do you improve the efficiency of propulsion with electric mobility. But as we went around the world, we realized we have a much more powerful story to tell around how citizens can live in an urban environment, how they can live responsible lives, how they can lead sustainable lives. So, for example, when we host our events, we don't offer parking at the racetrack, which is a sort of unusual thing for sports. So we're trying to encourage the use of public transport. So that's just a very simple example of how we try to make sure that we think holistically around the event. And the other thing we've seen, I think, in the last 5 years is we're held to a different standard, right? So at first blush, you wouldn't think a motorsport would be particularly energy efficient. But what happens is because we've had this message, our consumers expect more from us, right? So they start looking at, okay, well, how do you put these events on? The truth is, to go around the world, to tell this story, to go to cities, 70% of our carbon footprint is logistics. So we work really closely with our friends at ABB and DHL about how do we do route planning and make sure that the logistics are done in the most efficient way possible. And then just to touch on the net zero carbon piece, because that's obviously a big discussion here with COP and a lot of pledges. What we said is actually we've been measuring from day one. We're fortunate, right? We don't have so much of a history. We've only got a 7-year history. We've been measuring from day one, reducing. And we said, why don't we really set the standard within sport? And we'll do net zero carbon from inception and forevermore. And so we have this commitment to reduce our emissions by 30% by 2030. And then we're offsetting the rest with local renewable energy projects that we're investing in each of the markets in which we race.
Do you think other sports are going to be held to the same level of scrutiny that Formula E is currently?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I started this role 2 years ago, I thought we're the good guys, right? We're promoting electric mobility, but actually our consumers, our fans are younger. They certainly have more of an advocacy voice, and they're holding us to different standards. And what we said is, look, let's serve as a reference point for the sports industry. And we've been really encouraged. I think you saw recently there was a football match in the Premier League. It was Tottenham and Chelsea. Said, okay, that's the first net zero carbon football match. Now that's one match. But we think that's a good start, and certainly we push really hard with our peers in other sports to make sure that they're taking this seriously.
Digital technologies, Theo, is huge. It's a big part of what you do. It's a big part of your collaboration with Formula E as well. It enables new business models. It enables the circular economy that we need for this, low carbon society. It empowers workers. It empowers citizens. It gives us knowledge. It helps us optimize energy use. Just explain how that wonderful umbrella all works.
Well, it's a big question, but of course, if we focus on the digital part, this is really an enabler on top of already, all the other elements I talked about before. And we look at it as an enabler of decisions. So we talk about digital technology helping to enable, for example, in a large company or in a large organization, all the employees to also make right decisions because you have the information at hand. If you can measure it, you can act. And this is how, for example, internally we drive that in terms, I said before, going carbon neutral.
You wouldn't think, Ulrika, that when I think about the UNDP, the first thing I don't think about is digital. But digital, it's a big part, isn't it, of your message? Because you're helping countries build inclusive, ethical, and sustainable digital societies. Just help me with the digital side. Help our audience with that side, because it's fascinating.
No, and as a matter of fact, UNDP's well-known flagship report, the Human Development Report, warned for the digital field being a field where we could see this driving increasing inequalities, and this was before the pandemic hit the world. And of course, throughout the 1.5 years now with the pandemic, we've seen that it has really been one of the main drivers of increasing inequalities, and hence, of course, UNDP also sees that digital needs to be the enabler for everything we do if we speak about sustainable development. So we have, in our updated strategic plan, put digital at the forefront. We had made quite a lot of investments, and we could actually use those investments to see to that governments could function, that courts could function, parliaments could function, also in least developed countries and even some middle-income economies throughout the crisis. But here we need to see increased investments as well. And here we also see there's a lot of potential with regard to partnership with the private sector. And once again, here's where we can connect the dots also because we have the overview as we are supporting countries moving from pledges to impact with regard to these.
Has the connecting of the dots, Ulrika, become more difficult given what's happened, to the world in the last 18 months, 2 years?
No, on the contrary, I would say that I believe that there is more potential. While we see, and this is of course very concerning, a decrease of foreign direct investments, especially to these developed countries and some of the SIDS economies that have a very difficult time now. We do believe that we, through these increased ambitions, but also the quality of the plans, as I've alluded to a number of times, can actually drive investments to projects that would be of interest also for commercial actors. So we believe that there's a lot of potential because we have so much more data and then qualitative plans that can be the basis for new cooperation and partnerships, both in the digital field, in the energy field, and also in a number of other fields.
Jamie, we're in Glasgow, so the temptation is just to focus on the E of the S and the G. We mentioned the G a little bit. We'll come to the G in a minute. More government and policy more than governance. But I want to focus on the S because the S is the social, the inclusiveness. And it's so important not to forget the S or the inclusiveness letter of ESG. And you're doing a lot, aren't you, on inclusiveness?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think it's fair to say that motorsport traditionally is a fairly, male and frankly European or American endeavor. But actually, we have one team, for example, that's run and owned and managed by a woman and takes great pride in having a number of their staff and engineers being female. And then we've partnered actually with the FIA, which is our governing body, and ABB as well, around a program called Girls on Track, which is really meant to widen the lens of what motorsport can be in terms of careers, right? I mean, obviously, you think of the sports people, and a lot of them tend to be sportsmen, right? The drivers themselves, but actually what goes into supporting a team in terms of the medical support, the engineering, the science, battery technology, all that goes into developing a race car, there's actually a very broad set of opportunities there. And so we've invested with the FIA and with ABB in this Girls on Track program, which is really bringing together young women, so 6 years old to teenage age, in all the cities we go into. We tend to focus on the emerging markets. So we do it in Mexico, we do it in Saudi Arabia. Yeah. And it's a full day program where there's a little bit of fun, racing some go-karts and things like that, but also learning about all the different verticals of professional careers you can have in motorsport that go beyond the person in the cockpit. And so we're pretty proud of that. It's early stage on that program, but it's a really important piece.
Yeah, Theo, on the inclusiveness side, and I want to sort of segue, it's within the same ballpark. Skills, competencies, with these new technologies, the older industries, they get displaced and people don't have a job and they need to be retrained. They need new skills as we increase acceptance of all these new technologies that we're talking about. Are we focusing enough on training in both developed and developing economies?
I think the short answer is probably not. And it is very high on our agenda to build that out. I mean, the Girls on Track program is one example, which is, it's a very good example where, us as a technology company, we need a lot of engineers. We drive a very, very ambitious diversity and inclusion strategy also within the company. And it's one of the areas, for example, gender diversity has been very difficult for us to drive in the past because there simply hasn't been enough women available who have studied STEM subjects in engineering and et cetera around the world. So this is one, kind of topic where we drive. So it's not, if the girls in the end get excited and go into motorsport, of course, for us, that's great. I think we would like them rather get excited about technology, go study engineering, and then go work in ABB or any other of companies in and around us and become CEO and drive. And I think going back to your original point about the E and S and the G, I think for us, they're all interlinked.
Of course.
And in order to achieve positive impact and drive progress on the E, we also need to have a diverse and inclusive, society and an organizational driving those agendas, because otherwise you will end up driving it only in one direction.
And gender equality obviously is massive for you, isn't it, Ulrika? I mean, along with the obvious ones, poverty, inequality, governance, resilience, environment, energy. But let's focus on the gender equality. Tell us some of the things you're doing.
Yeah, no, and once again, some good news. I think badly needed these days when we are actually very concerned about the future. And 96% of the countries that we have accompanied, 120 member states, have included gender into their national determined contributions. And 75% of them, they are prioritizing youth. And this is something that we have not seen before. And I think it speaks to what we also mentioned here previously. I mean, the understanding that young people, consumers, they want something different with regard to decision makers, but also if they are employed by companies, they want to see companies that are responsible. And I think sometimes it's our imagination that is the biggest hindrance, because I do think that many of these young people see the possibilities in this agenda, and they want to be drivers of change, and they want to work with companies that are drivers of change. And I think that this is also going to be a very important factor into the technology development that we hopefully will see with a lot of young women also.
I'm glad you brought that up, Ulrika, because just coming back to the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, which we're all trying to get governments to lay out their details, that's essentially what it's about. I'm glad you brought up that it's not just about we pledge to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by this date. It's far deeper, isn't it?
It is, yeah. They are much higher quality, and this is very promising. So while it doesn't add up to what we have decided, and this is, of course, incredibly concerning, as we said in the beginning, I mean, the target of 1.5 is very far away. We're heading towards almost 3 degrees, but still the quality of the plans, what they can actually be turned into with regard to action, is so much better than what we've seen before, and really lays the ground for good partnerships to drive and accelerate the action.
Let's get to policy. Let's get to regulation. Jamie, how are governments, how are the rule makers helping you, hindering you in achieving what we're setting out to achieve today? All these things. What barriers are existing right now to effective policy formulation and implementation from the Formula E electric car standpoint?
Yeah, from a Formula E perspective, I think generally the government regulation has been a positive thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I had a conversation with one unnamed executive of a German manufacturer who said a couple of years ago, why are we in Formula E? Well, we're in Formula E because of Dieselgate. We're in Formula E because of Tesla, right? And so one of them is a regulatory pressure question, and the other is an innovative company who's disrupting their industry in a pretty material way. And so, we try to partner very closely with governments everywhere we race. By definition, when we go into a race,
just by being there,
what we do is we have to shut down the city streets. And so at a minimum, there's a serious conversation that happens with the local authorities. And typically when we go into to markets, we're having a conversation at the national level as well. And so, we're trying to work closely with government to be able to push forward these agendas. It's clear that where we are today, the percentage of electric vehicles, never mind on the road, but just new purchases, is still tiny. In most countries, it's 1 or 2%. I think you have Norway, Sweden is probably quite high as well, 40, 50%. But generally speaking, it's still tiny. And so you need that government regulation to
you need
force
a lot
down.
of chargers, don't you?
Well,
was it 750 million chargers are needed by 2050? I think that's the stat. Ulrika's nodding, so I'll say that's definitely the stat. That's a lot of infrastructure.
Correct. I mean, I think you have a couple things, right? You have the consumer perception of quality of the product, right? Is it a performing car? Ultimately, a car, to the extent that you have the means of purchasing one, it's an expression of yourself, right? It's a brand statement on a very personal level, and so the quality of the product needs to be there. you need to have confidence that it can work, right? So you can drive the distances you need to drive. That has to do with battery capacity and efficiency of the powertrain, and then the charging, so you can bridge those gaps. And then finally, it's cost, right? I mean, the reality is the vast majority of electric vehicles tend to be much higher priced because of where battery technology is. That's converging pretty dramatically. I think we think around 2023, 24, the line will cross. I think, Tesla is not part of Formula E, but I think when you look at their market cap today, it's pretty clear that, consumers are voting that they produce a fantastic product. And I think that's pushing people along as well. So there's no silver bullet. The regulation piece is important. The infrastructure piece is important. And ultimately, I'm a big believer that consumer demand will dictate, right? So our manufacturers need to produce quality products that excite people to buy. And if they do that, you'll see it. And one final point, if I use Porsche as an example, Porsche sold as many Taycans, which is their electric car, in the first 9 months as 911. The 911 was developed in the 1960s. The Taycan was launched in 2019. So that tells me that if you make a really good product, people want it. And that consumer pull will matter.
I mean, just to add, I think 100% agree with everything Jamie said. I think you just need to add the renewable energy or the green energy to that whole mix. And I think that's the huge opportunity if you go back to the government, where they need to really step in and enable that. We need to triple the investments in this over the next decade. So
how do governments do that? What would you want? What would you like? What do we need to hear from governments?
Well, just simple examples. Again, if we stick to e-mobility, government could step in and say, if you build a new house, if you renovate a new house, there has to be a charger, because you need to have the infrastructure in place to remove, so to say, the practical barriers for people to use them. Even though we are a global leader in EV charging infrastructure, and we have already installed close to 500,000 chargers in more than 88 markets. As you said, 750 million. I never heard that number, but whatever the number is, it's still a fraction of what will be needed in order for this transition to happen effectively on a global basis. And their government needs to step in. Many governments, you mentioned Norway, they were very early on that. They also have the green energy behind it, thanks to hydro and other sources. So they have really effectively pushed that through by incentivizing people to buy an electric car rather than a combustion car. And today, the vast majority of new cars sold in Norway are just electric, both because it's good product, and it's convenient to use. But it's also better, and it's from a cost perspective equally or less.
Ulrika, when we talk about electrification, we mustn't forget, and I suppose it's easy to forget, not from your standpoint, where you're sitting, but maybe here in Glasgow in the higher income parts of the world, that nearly 800 million people in the world actually live without electricity. 2.6 billion people live without access to clean cooking. We mustn't forget that, must we, while we are on this trajectory towards net emissions in 2050. This clean energy gap, it really needs to be closed. And it needs to be closed this decade, doesn't it, Ulrika?
Yes, that's true. And here's, of course, where the continued discussions about shared but differentiated responsibilities that we see in each and every conference of the party is really important, because the developing countries, they are calling for this promise of the rich countries to support with $100 billion US dollars, also what needs to be done in developing economies. And I think that this was also part of Sylvan's message that we heard earlier. But having said that, I mean, there are a lot of possibilities to see to that we can drive investments, as I said, beyond also the overseas development assistance that needs to be part of this equation. And what we have seen is that the change of attitudes that is needed in the developing in the G20 economies, being responsible for 80% of the global emissions. I mean, that's really important to say as well. Will also be part of driving change also in the developing economies that can see that they can leapfrog into new technologies if they have the support and the conditions to do so. And listening also to the conversation, I think it's interesting because we're also in our human development report looking at attitudes, and we actually see that people are very inspired, of course, of taking responsibility. They are even more inspired when they see their neighbor putting solar cellars on the rooftop or buying an electric car. But what we will do now, of course, as I said, is to accompany countries and see to that we can give the right conditions also with regard to policy making and needed reforms. And one of the global initiatives that we have taken is the support to the Secretary General's call on fossil fuel subsidy reform. So there are some reforms that are more important than others that will really drive and accelerate the change that we need to see. And we believe that if we can support countries to put in place the reduction of fossil fuel subsidies, then we can also make necessary investments in infrastructure that is sustainable. And that is, of course, also very promising. We open up the fiscal space for investments that are needed for electrification of the transports, for instance.
Yeah. What else is Formula E doing, Jamie? I think you're working with, is it UNICEF to help
That's right,
developing
yeah.
nations? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so last year, as we were reflecting, I guess, as a company, what more we could do when we were on lockdown, we weren't able to host any races. We said, how can we have a bigger impact? And what's clear is, the climate crisis has no borders. And I think the voices that perhaps were forgotten in all this is, I'm sort of middle-aged, if you will, right? So we're thinking about, the next generation is going to inherit the earth, and that people talk about it conceptually, but then we said, okay, how can we really do something concrete? And so we partnered with UNICEF with the Safe and Healthy Environment Fund, which is, I think actually the Swedish government is a supporter as well. And that was, us committing resources, both in terms of time and access to our talent, the drivers and our engineers and whatnot, as well as capital and resources to do training programs and to fund that fund to do activities in each of the markets that we race in. So again, we'll focus more in markets, in emerging markets. So we'll do something in Jakarta this year. We go there in June. We do an activity in Mexico. Last year, we launched it with an activity in London where we invited a number of young UNICEF representatives just to come and have a conversation with myself, with our board members, about the importance to the young generations around climate change. So, we're trying to do our piece.
Yeah, and Jamie, ABB is clearly, as you say, it's a global company. If you implement something here, it's everywhere. What else are you doing to help the developing world on the energy transition?
Well, we do a lot of things, and I would directly go to, of course, I mentioned before the fact that we ourselves try to lead by example and thereby use our own technology. And no matter where that is in the world, we have the same standards, the same plans. But we drive also very active social agenda within our overarching sustainability, going to your ESG approach. And thanks to the fact that we are local in more than 100 countries in the world, we have the opportunity to, on a local basis, also work with the communities on education, diversity and inclusion, sometimes also disaster relief. We saw over the last couple of years increasing amount of such activities where we are able to very quickly go in and help after some type of a disaster that happens probably or sometimes because of climate change. So we see it as super important, but again, also collaborating across platforms together with the United Nations or Formula E or others.
I love your both your websites, the importance of, clearly you're collaborating, but the importance of collaboration, it's stressed again and again and again. I mean, you two are working wonderfully together, aren't you?
Yes.
most of the time.
I think what's relevant for us, we are, a global motorsport, a global racing series. We only have 150 employees.
Yeah.
We're actually a very small company. And so in order for us to, propagate our message, we need to partner with automotive manufacturers where there's a direct link with the product, with partners like ABB who have 30,000 employees or so. So it's
105,000.
Three times that, right? So how do we get our message out? And we partner with corporates and we partner with government entities to be able to exponentially propagate that message. Otherwise, we're a very small voice in the grand scheme of things.
We're also planning to accelerate that. We've been now partner for a few years, or title partner of Formula E World Championship.
Yeah.
But we're also starting to see the opportunity to partner and collaborate even more. So, for example, we were in New York last year. We can even get the Secretary of Energy to participate in an event. You can bring in all kinds of stakeholders just to talk about the opportunities of the transition to electric mobility, but also the social piece if you don't do it. So I think that's it's everything is about driving collaboration.
Without getting too geeky, I was watching a video about tire traction and how it can help energy efficiency. That was on your website. We're not going to go there, but just quickly-ish, Jamie, because we're running out of time, and I could talk to you, all the three of you, for 10 days. It's wonderful. Make it clear for us the technologies that you're using today in Formula E, which will be used by us, and how quickly that process, like the amazing technologies you're using, which we're going to be using very, very soon, how that happens.
Yeah. Well, and the themes in automotive, right? It's electric they're connected.
Yeah.
So it's a heavily software influenced environment. And the race cars today are 97, 98% energy efficient. So there's not a lot more gains to be had there. The size of the battery, the density of the battery cell packs will get much higher. So in very simple terms, our car next year will be 100 kilos lighter than this year's and 100 kilowatts more power. So for the Americans, that's 135 horsepower or so. So you don't need to be an engineer to know if it's 100 kilos lighter and it's got 130 more horsepower, the cars are going to go much quicker. Why is that relevant to a road car? The size of the battery, the cost of the battery, the density of the battery is really important, in terms of the affordability of the cars. And then the software controls are very powerful. So if I use an example with Jaguar, one of the teams in Formula, they have the I-Pace, which is their electric car. They did an over-the-air software update from learnings that they had in Formula E around regeneration in the race that added 20 kilometers of range to the Jaguar I-Pace if you're an owner. So you think of a car as something that is a naturally depreciating asset, but there they were able to actually extend the life of the car, extend the range through some of the software learnings. Don't ask me the detail of how that happened, but the level of coding and software development that goes into a Formula E is pretty incredible. And they apply that into the road car programs in short order. That was an 18-month development cycle.
Ulrika, you're here with us in spirit in Glasgow. We're so glad you are here representing the UNDP and the amazing work you're doing, as you've told us, on NDCs as well. It's incredible. What's the message, Ulrika? This is obviously, we're heading towards the end of this fantastic panel. What's the message? The title of this panel in the sustainability series is Embedding Sustainability. Taking that into account, what's your message to all the stakeholders, both in Glasgow and watching across the world?
I think what we've understood by now is that we need to change our entire view on economy and really move beyond also the GDP concept and look at this from the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that this is what this discussion has been all about. And I would just like to say that, as we also hold the UN system's largest climate portfolio, as I said, working in 170 countries, we have had over 433 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions avoided as part of this portfolio. We can do so much more in partnerships. We're talking about half of Germany's CO2 emissions reduction in 2019, or taking 94 million of these cars that should not be on the roads, but be substituted with public transports, but also electric cars for a whole year. So there's a lot of potential in everything we need to do and have to do. And we need to scale up and use, as I've said, these plans that we now have in place as this opportunity to scale up and to bring partnerships and investments into also the developing economies and also the middle-income countries suffering quite a lot also from the economic stress caused by the pandemic.
Scale up partnership investments. Jamie, what's your message to our stakeholders present and watching in from across the world?
Well, obviously, this is a very critical time. And, I opened, I guess, by saying I was maybe apprehensive, but also optimistic. And I think what's great about this conference is the level of attention from the media, the level of attention from government officials, corporations, private companies. That level of collaboration is absolutely critical. And for Formula E, like I said before, we're a small company in the grand scheme of things, but we live very much a message of collaborating and partnering up with other businesses and governments in order to shout with a slightly louder voice than we would do on our own. And I think if we can all do that collectively, we're going to make good progress.
Theo, it's your job to
round it off.
Yeah.
Well, maybe if I just say by that, we talk a lot about climate change as a huge threat. And of course, it is a huge threat, but it's also a big opportunity for us to come together and really use, in our view, the technology and people coming together to drive positive progress to what Ulrika just said, a more balanced future state of how society, the economy, etc., hangs together. And I think all the focus now here at COP is very much on emissions. And we shouldn't forget that as part of that overall equation of driving progress to a more sustainable future is the whole circularity topic. I think it will be hugely important also for the topic of climate change, but never also forget the whole social dimension and the fact that the world isn't equal everywhere. And we should make sure we bring everyone with us.
Thank you all. And so ends Embedding Sustainability. Fantastic fourth panel in our sustainability series. Thank you very much, Theo. Ulrika, you were here with us in spirit. Thank you so much for your time. It was as if you were on the stage, and Jamie as well. Thank you all for your insights. Absolutely brilliant way to end the series. Thank you.